A man stands outside the imposing marble columns of Meridian Trust Bank, golden keys gleaming in his weathered hands. The same hands that once trembled with nervous hope now hold the deed to the very institution that crushed his dreams. This is Kieran Vasquez, and 3 years ago, the bank behind him wouldn't even give him 5 minutes to explain his business plan. Today, he owns every brick, every vault, every leather chair where the executives once sat in judgment. But how did a man with calloused hands and an accent that made loan officers uncomfortable become the owner of a century-old financial institution? How did someone they dismissed as high risk end up holding their fate in his palm? This isn't just a story about money or revenge. It's about the power of quiet determination, the weight of dignity, and what happens when someone refuses to let rejection define their destiny. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about setbacks forever. This is the story of how one man's greatest humiliation became his most powerful weapon. Kieran Vasquez arrived in Millbrook 3 years ago with nothing but a duffel bag, a toolbox, and a dream that seemed impossible to everyone except him. At 28, he carried the weight of 2 worlds on his shoulders: the memories of his homeland in Honduras and the promises he'd made to his family. His mother, Esperanza, lay in a hospital bed back home, her medical bills mounting like storm clouds. His younger sister, Lucia, had just been accepted to university but couldn't afford the tuition. Kieran wasn't like the other immigrants who found work in Millbrook's factories. He had a gift with engines, a sixth sense for the mechanical heartbeat of any vehicle. Back home, he'd been known as El Mecánico Milagroso, the miracle mechanic, because he could resurrect cars that other mechanics had declared dead. But gifts don't pay bills, and miracles don't qualify you for bank loans. The industrial town of Millbrook had seen better days. Once thriving factories now stood like hollow monuments to a more prosperous past. The main street, where Meridian Trust Bank had anchored the business district for over a century, felt like a museum of faded hopes. Yet Kieran saw something different when he walked these streets. Where others saw decay, he saw opportunity. His dream was simple yet seemed mountainous: to open Vasquez Automotive, a full-service repair shop that would serve the working-class families of Millbrook with honest prices and quality work. He'd found the perfect location, a defunct garage on Industrial Avenue that had been abandoned for 2 years. The owner wanted to sell, and Kieran had calculated exactly what he needed: $45,000 for the building, equipment, and 6 months of operating capital. After 18 months of working 3 jobs, mornings at the tire shop, afternoons at the gas station, and evenings cleaning offices, Kieran had managed to save $18,000. For the remaining $27,000, he would need a loan. And that's where Meridian Trust Bank entered his story. The morning of March 15th felt different to Kieran. He'd pressed his only dress shirt until it looked crisp, polished his worn leather shoes until they gleamed, and organized his loan application with the precision of a surgeon. Inside the manila folder were his business plan, financial projections, letters of recommendation from his employers, and proof of his savings. He'd practiced his presentation in the mirror, addressing every concern he imagined they might have. Meridian Trust Bank stood like a fortress of old money and older prejudices. Its marble facade had witnessed the town's rise and decline, and its interior spoke of an era when banking was conducted with handshakes between men who looked remarkably similar. The lobby, with its polished mahogany and brass fixtures, seemed designed to intimidate rather than welcome. Kieran approached the reception desk where a young woman with perfectly styled blonde hair looked up from her computer. "Good morning," he said, his English carefully measured. "I have an appointment with the loan officer at 10 o'clock. Kieran Vasquez." She glanced at her screen, then at him, then back at her screen. "Oh yes, Mrs. Thornfield will see you. Please have a seat." Beatrice Thornfield emerged from her office 15 minutes later, her heels clicking against the marble floor like a countdown timer. She was a woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, with silver hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows. Everything about her posture suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Vasquez, is it?" she said, pronouncing his name with the same enthusiasm she might reserve for a dental procedure. "Please, come in." Her office was a shrine to traditional banking. Leather-bound books, a grandfather clock, and photographs of her shaking hands with local businessmen who all shared her complexion. Kieran sat across from her massive desk, feeling like a defendant before a judge. "So," she began, not looking up from his application, "you want to open an auto repair shop?" "Yes, ma'am, I have extensive experience." "I see here you've been in the country for 18 months. She said this like it was a criminal offense. "And you're currently employed at 3 different jobs?" "Yes, ma'am. I work hard to support my family and save for this opportunity." Beatrice finally looked at him, her eyes scanning from his carefully combed hair to his calloused hands. "Mr. Vasquez, I appreciate your ambition. But Meridian Trust Bank has been serving this community for over a century. We have certain standards, certain expectations of our borrowers." "I understand, ma'am. That's why I've prepared a comprehensive business plan. If you look at page 3, you'll see my projected revenue streams, and—" "I'm sure you've worked very hard on this," she interrupted, closing the folder without looking at page 3. "But the reality is, small businesses have a very high failure rate. Nearly 80% fail within the first 2 years. When you add in the challenges of language barriers, cultural differences, and lack of established credit history, the risk becomes simply too great for our institution." Kieran felt the room grow smaller around him. "Mrs. Thornfield, I've been building credit for 18 months. I have letters of recommendation from my employers, proof of my savings, and—" "Mr. Vasquez," she said, standing up to signal the end of the meeting, "I'm going to be frank with you. This bank has a responsibility to its shareholders and depositors. We can't take chances on ventures that don't align with our risk profile. I'm sure there are other institutions more suited to your needs. Perhaps you should consider a smaller loan, or maybe look into government assistance programs for your demographic." The words hit Kieran like physical blows. He stood slowly, gathering his folder with hands that trembled slightly. "I see. Thank you for your time, Mrs. Thornfield." As he walked through the lobby, he felt the eyes of other customers on him. An elderly man in a 3-piece suit whispered something to his companion. A young mother pulled her child closer as he passed. The receptionist didn't look up from her computer. Outside, the March air felt sharp against his face. Kieran sat on the bus bench across from the bank, staring at the building that had just reduced his dreams to a risk profile. But instead of despair, something else began to burn in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more calculating. It was the quiet determination of a man who had just been given the most powerful motivation in the world. The chance to prove someone wrong. The rejection from Meridian Trust Bank didn't break Kieran Vasquez. It forged him. That evening he sat in his small apartment, surrounded by the papers he'd so carefully prepared, and made a decision that would change everything. If traditional banking wouldn't give him a chance, he would create his own path. Within a week, he'd rented the old garage on Industrial Avenue. With his savings and a handshake deal with the owner, Vasquez Automotive opened, with used equipment, borrowed tools, and a hand-painted sign that cost him $30. He worked 18-hour days, accepting any job that came his way: oil changes, brake repairs, transmission work that other shops deemed too challenging. But Kieran understood something that Beatrice Thornfield never would. Reputation is the only currency that truly matters in a small town. He charged fair prices, did honest work, and treated every customer's car like it was his own. When Mrs. Chen's old Honda wouldn't start, he fixed it for free, because he knew she was a widow living on Social Security. When the local pastor's church van broke down before a food drive, Kieran worked through the night to get it running. Salute you to Catherine Landering. Words spread through Millbrook's working-class neighborhoods like wildfire. Here was a mechanic who didn't talk down to you, who explained what was wrong in plain English, who stood behind his work. Soon, Kieran had a waiting list of customers. But he wasn't just fixing cars. He was studying. Every night after closing the shop, he read business journals, financial newspapers, and books on investing. He learned about corporate structure, market analysis, and the intricate relationships between banks and their communities. He discovered that Meridian Trust Bank wasn't just old-fashioned. It was struggling. The bank's quarterly reports published in the local newspaper told a story of declining profits and increasing bad debts. Their loan portfolio was concentrated in the very industries that were leaving Millbrook. They'd made big bets on manufacturing companies that were moving operations overseas, on real estate developments that never materialized, on the kind of safe investments that weren't so safe anymore. Meanwhile, Kieran was building something different. He'd started with immigrant customers who, like him, had been turned away by traditional banks. He knew their stories, their dreams, their willingness to work 3 jobs to achieve something better. When Carlos Rodriguez wanted to expand his landscaping business, Kieran didn't just recommend him to a lender, he became his partner. When Maria Santos needed capital for her catering company, Kieran used his growing profits to help finance her equipment. Slowly, quietly, Kieran was creating a network of small businesses that supported each other. His automotive shop became the unofficial headquarters for Millbrook's emerging immigrant economy. Contractors, landscapers, restaurant owners, cleaning services, they all knew that if they needed honest advice, fair prices, or someone who understood their struggles, they could find it at Vasquez Automotive. They could find it at Vasquez Automotive. 2 years after his rejection, Kieran had not only paid off his debts but had started investing. He bought stock in companies he understood. Automotive suppliers, tool manufacturers, businesses that served the working class. His portfolio grew slowly but steadily, and with it his understanding of how money really worked in America. The turning point came when he read about a small regional bank in Ohio that had been bought by a group of local investors. The article explained how community banks were struggling against larger institutions, how they were vulnerable to takeovers if they couldn't adapt to changing demographics and economic conditions. That's when Kieran realized that banks weren't untouchable fortresses. They were just businesses, and like any business, they could be bought. He started researching Meridian Trust Bank with the same intensity he'd once applied to learning English. He studied their financial statements, their board of directors, their major shareholders. He learned about banking regulations, acquisition procedures, and the legal requirements for changing ownership. What he discovered was both surprising and encouraging. Meridian Trust Bank was in much worse shape than anyone realized. The 3rd anniversary of Kieran's rejection arrived on a cold March morning. But this time he wasn't the nervous young man clutching a loan application. He was the owner of the most successful automotive business in Millbrook, a minor celebrity in the immigrant community, and the senior partner in a group of investors who had been quietly accumulating capital for months. His network had grown far beyond what anyone at Meridian Trust Bank could have imagined. Rodriguez Landscaping now employed 23 people. Santos Catering had expanded to serve corporate events throughout the county. The cleaning service that started with 3 women in a van now operated a fleet of vehicles and employed dozens of families. These weren't just businesses. They were success stories, proof that the high-risk demographic that banks like Meridian Trust had dismissed were actually the most motivated, hard-working, and reliable customers you could find. Kieran had done more than build a business. He'd built a movement. And now, with his attorney's help, he was about to make the biggest move of all. The legal documents were prepared with the same meticulous attention he'd once applied to his original loan application. His group of investors, now formally organized as Millbrook Community Investment Partners, had raised $2.3 million. It seemed impossible that people who couldn't get $1,000 loans 3 years ago were now prepared to buy an entire bank. But that's exactly what had happened. The timing was perfect. Meridian Trust Bank's latest quarterly report showed their worst performance in decades. 2 major loan defaults had decimated their reserves. Their board of directors was facing pressure from regulators to either find new capital or consider selling. The bank that had once seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was now desperate for exactly what Kieran's group offered: local investment, community commitment, and fresh leadership. The acquisition process took 3 months of legal negotiations, regulatory approval, and financial due diligence. Through it all, Kieran maintained his daily routine, opening the shop at 7, working with customers, studying late into the night. But now his studies focused on banking operations, community development, and the art of turning rejection into opportunity. The morning of the ownership transfer, Kieran arrived at Meridian Trust Bank at exactly 9 o'clock. He wore the same dress shirt he'd worn 3 years ago, now supplemented by a navy blue suit that fit him perfectly. In his hands he carried a different kind of folder, one containing the keys to his new business, the trust of his community, and the power to reshape how banking was done in Millbrook. The lobby looked exactly the same: marble columns, brass fixtures, and the same intimidating atmosphere designed to make working-class customers feel unwelcome. But now Kieran saw it differently. He saw an opportunity to create something better. The receptionist, the same blonde woman who had barely acknowledged him 3 years ago, looked up with confusion. "I'm sorry, sir, but we're closed to regular business this morning. We're having a transition meeting." "I know," Kieran said quietly. "I'm here for the transition. I'm the new owner." Her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and, finally, shock. "You're Mr. Vasquez?" "Yes, ma'am. Could you please let Mrs. Thornfield know I'm here?" The next few minutes felt like an eternity. Kieran could hear muffled conversations from the back offices, the sound of phones ringing, the nervous energy of people whose world was about to change. Finally, Beatrice Thornfield emerged from her office, her face pale, and her usual composure cracked. She approached him slowly, as if he were a mirage that might disappear if she moved too quickly. "Monsieur Vasquez? I don't understand. They said the new owner was here, but I thought—" "You thought what, Mrs. Thornfield?" She struggled to find words. We were told it was a group of local investors, but I never imagined. Then he would be me." Kieran's voice was calm, patient. "The same man whose loan application you rejected 3 years ago without even reading it." The color drained from her face. I remember that meeting, but how is this possible?" "The same way anything becomes possible in America, Mrs. Thornfield. Hard work, smart decisions, and the refusal to accept that someone else's prejudice defines your limitations." Other bank employees had begun to gather in the lobby, drawn by the unprecedented scene of their former loan officer stammering in front of a man they'd all dismissed as irrelevant. Kieran recognized some of them: the tellers who had watched him leave with his rejected application, the assistant managers who had whispered about those people and their unrealistic expectations. "I'd like to address everyone," Kieran said, his voice carrying the authority of ownership. "Could you please gather your colleagues?" Within minutes, the entire staff of Meridian Trust Bank was assembled in the lobby. 23 employees, ranging from recent college graduates to veterans who had worked there for decades. They stood in uncomfortable silence, uncertain whether they were about to be fired, lectured, or worse. Kieran stood before them, holding the same folder he'd once brought as a desperate applicant. "My name is Kieran Vasquez, and as of this morning I am the majority owner of this bank. I know that some of you remember me from 3 years ago, when I came here seeking a loan to start my business. I was told that I didn't fit your risk profile, that people like me were too dangerous to invest in." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I want you to know that I don't blame you individually for that decision. Institutional prejudice is bigger than any one person, and it's been the way business is done in this town for generations. But that era ends today." Beatrice Thornfield stepped forward, her voice barely above a whisper. What are you going to do to us?" Kieran looked at her with something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'm going to give you the same thing I wanted 3 years ago. A chance. A chance to prove that you can learn, that you can grow, that you can become better than your worst moments." He opened his folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is my original business plan, the one you rejected without reading. I'd like you to read it now, out loud, so everyone can hear what you dismissed as Too risky. With shaking hands, Beatrice took the paper. Her voice trembled as she read. Vasquez Automotive will serve the working families of Millbrook with honest, affordable car repair services. Our mission is to build trust through quality work, fair pricing, and respect for every customer who walks through our doors. We believe that success comes from treating people with dignity, regardless of their background, and that a business thrives when it serves its community rather than just its profit. The lobby was silent except for the sound of the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Several employees shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the contrast between Kieran's mission statement and their own bank's practices. The business, Kieran continued, has been profitable every month for the past 3 years. It employs 6 people full-time and has helped dozens of other small businesses get started. The risk you were so worried about turned out to be the most reliable investment anyone could make. A bet on hard work and human dignity. He walked to the center of the lobby, addressing the entire staff. I'm not here to punish anyone or to settle old scores. I'm here to transform this bank into something it should have been all along. A true community institution that serves everyone, not just the people who look like you or sound like you. Starting tomorrow, we will begin training all loan officers in cultural sensitivity and community development. We will actively seek out small businesses and immigrant entrepreneurs who have been underserved by traditional banking. We will measure our success not just in profits, but in the number of dreams we help make possible. He turned back to Beatrice. Mrs. Thornfield, I'm offering you the chance to stay and learn a new way of doing business. You can become an advocate for the people you once dismissed, or you can continue in your old patterns and find yourself unemployed. The choice is yours. Tears had begun to form in her eyes. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet, Kieran replied gently. Just think about it. Think about the person you want to be and the legacy you want to leave. Then decide whether you want to be part of building something better or part of preserving something broken. As the staff began to disperse, Kieran walked to the elevator that would take him to the president's office. The same elevator he'd never been invited to use, the same floor where decisions about his future had been made without his input. The president's office was exactly what he'd expected. Leather chairs, mahogany desk, windows overlooking the town square. But it felt smaller than he'd imagined, less intimidating. It was just a room where frightened people had made small decisions based on even smaller thinking. Kieran sat behind the desk and looked out the window at the town that had become his home. On the street below he could see Rodriguez landscaping trucks, children walking to school, small businesses that had flourished despite being ignored by traditional lenders. This was his community now, and this bank would serve it the way it deserved to be served, with respect, with opportunity, and with the understanding that America's greatest strength had always been its ability to transform rejection into possibility. 6 months later, Kieran stood in the same lobby where he'd once been humiliated, watching as Beatrice Thornfield approved a loan for a young Somali woman who wanted to open a tailoring business. The transformation had been remarkable, not just of the bank, but of the people within it. Under Kieran's leadership, Meridian Trust Bank had approved more small business loans than it had in the previous 5 years combined. The bank's loan default rate had actually decreased, proving that the high-risk customers traditional banking had avoided were actually more reliable than anyone had imagined. Beatrice had chosen to stay, and her growth had been extraordinary. She'd learned Spanish, attended cultural competency training, and slowly earned the trust of customers who had every reason to doubt her. When she approved that first loan to an immigrant entrepreneur, she cried at her desk, not from sadness, but from the realization of how many dreams she'd carelessly destroyed with her prejudice. But the real measure of success wasn't in the numbers or the recognition. It was in the everyday moments, when someone who'd been counted out got counted in, like the elderly Mexican man who'd been able to buy his first home at age 65, or the young woman who'd opened a successful daycare center after 3 other banks had turned her down. The bank's new motto, displayed prominently in the lobby, read, "Where dreams meet opportunity." But Kieran knew the real motto was simpler. Everyone deserves a chance. As he prepared to leave that Friday evening, Kieran reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The humiliation of that first rejection had been transformed into the foundation of something beautiful. The prejudice that had tried to limit him had become the fuel for unlimited possibility. A young entrepreneur was leaving the bank, clutching her approved loan documents with tears of joy in her eyes. She had the same look Kieran remembered from his own mirror 3 years ago, the look of someone whose dreams had just been validated. "Mr. Vasquez," she called out as he passed. "Thank you for believing in me when no one else would." Kieran smiled, remembering his own desperate hope on that bus bench across the street. "I didn't believe in you," he said gently. "I believed in your dream." There's a difference. Dreams don't ask permission to exist. They just need someone willing to invest in them. As he walked toward his car, Kieran passed the bus bench where he'd sat 3 years ago, processing his rejection and deciding what to do next. A small plaque now marked the spot, installed by the city council in recognition of his contributions to the community. It read, "Here sat a man who refused to accept no for an answer." But Kieran knew that wasn't quite right. He had accepted no for an answer. He just refused to accept it as the final answer. The difference between giving up and getting up wasn't in avoiding rejection, but in understanding that rejection was just information, not a verdict. He looked back at the bank one more time, at the marble columns that had once seemed so intimidating and now stood as guardians of opportunity. The same building, the same address, but everything inside had changed. Just like him. They had rejected his loan application, dismissing him as a risk not worth taking. Now they worked for him, learned from him, and had discovered that the greatest risk wasn't in saying yes to the wrong person, it was in saying no to the right one. The loan application that had been rejected 3 years ago was now framed on his office wall, not as a trophy of revenge, but as a reminder that every no contains the seed of a better yes. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting ahead. Kieran Vasquez had proven that the American dream wasn't about avoiding rejection. It was about transforming rejection into something so powerful that those who rejected you end up working for the very vision they once dismissed. They thought they were protecting their bank from him. Instead, they had protected him from settling for less than owning the whole damn thing. 5 years after Kieran Vasquez bought Meridian Trust Bank, the transformation extended far beyond the marble walls of one financial institution. The story of the rejected loan applicant who became a bank owner had become legend, but the real impact was measured in lives changed, communities rebuilt, and systems reformed. Dr. Elena Ramirez finished reviewing the quarterly economic report for Millbrook County with a satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. As the newly appointed Director of Community Development, she'd been tasked with documenting the unprecedented economic revival that had swept through what was once a dying industrial town. The numbers told a story that economists were calling the Millbrook Miracle. Small business formation had increased by 340% since Kieran's acquisition of the bank. The unemployment rate had dropped from 23% to 8.2%. Property values in previously neglected neighborhoods had stabilized and begun rising for the first time in decades. But more importantly, the demographic composition of business ownership had fundamentally shifted. Where once 89% of successful loan applicants were white males over 40, now the bank's portfolio reflected the true diversity of the community. Women owned 47% of the new businesses. Immigrants represented 52% of approved entrepreneurs. The average age of new business owners had dropped to 31. As younger dreamers found their visions taken seriously for the first time. The transformation hadn't been without its critics. Some old guard residents complained about the changing character of their town, about hearing Spanish in the grocery stores and seeing hijabs in the school pickup lines. But their voices were increasingly drowned out by the sound of construction, the bustle of new commerce, and the laughter of children playing in parks that had been empty for years. Marcus Thompson, a 34-year-old African-American veteran, represented the kind of success story that was becoming commonplace in the new Millbrook. After returning from deployment with PTSD and struggling to find work, he'd dreamed of opening a fitness center, specifically designed for veterans dealing with mental health challenges. 3 banks had rejected his application before he walked into Meridian Trust. The difference wasn't just that they approved my loan, Marcus explained to the documentary crew filming the town's transformation. It was how they treated me during the process. Mrs. Thornfield, the same loan officer who used to turn people away, she actually visited my proposed location, talked to potential customers, understood my vision. She didn't just see a risk, she saw an opportunity to serve our community's veterans. Thompson's Warrior Wellness Center now employed 12 people and served over 200 veterans from 3 counties. The success had attracted attention from the Department of Veterans Affairs, which was considering replicating the model nationally. Marcus had become a frequent speaker at entrepreneurship conferences, always beginning his presentations with the same line: "Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is getting rejected by the wrong people, because it forces you to find the right ones." The cultural shift extended to unexpected places. Millbrook High School had introduced a mandatory course called Entrepreneurship and Community Building, taught by local business owners who shared their stories of perseverance and innovation. Students learned not just about profit margins and marketing, but about dignity, resilience, and the responsibility that comes with success. 15-year-old Aisha Okonkwo, whose Nigerian parents had struggled to find capital for their medical practice, wrote in her final essay, "Before Mr. Vasquez bought the bank, my parents worked as hospital janitors, even though they were both doctors in Nigeria. Now they have their own clinic, and I'm planning to become a surgeon. The difference isn't just in their circumstances. It's in how our family is seen, how our dreams are valued, how our potential is recognized." The academic world had taken notice too. Professor James Wellington from Harvard Business School had been studying the Millbrook phenomenon for 2 years, trying to understand how one acquisition had catalyzed such widespread change. His preliminary findings challenged fundamental assumptions about risk assessment, community banking, and economic development. Traditional banking models focus on minimizing risk, Wellington explained in his emerging research, but Vasquez's approach focuses on maximizing potential. Instead of asking, "How likely is this person to fail?" they ask, "How can we help this person succeed?" It's a paradigm shift that's producing measurably better outcomes. The success hadn't gone unnoticed by larger financial institutions. Representatives from major banks had visited Millbrook, studying Kieran's methods and attempting to replicate his community-focused approach. But most found it impossible to scale the personal relationships, cultural understanding, and community investment that made Meridian Trust's model work. J.P. Morgan Chase had offered to buy the bank for triple its assessed value. Kieran's response had been swift and unequivocal. "Some things aren't for sale. This bank belongs to this community, and that's where it will stay." The ripple effects extended beyond economics into social cohesion. The annual Millbrook Unity Festival, started 3 years after Kieran's acquisition, celebrated the town's diversity through food, music, and storytelling. Former critics found themselves sampling pupusas from the Salvadoran restaurant, learning traditional dances from the Somali Community Center, and discovering that difference didn't diminish their town, it enriched it. But perhaps the most profound change was in the children. A new generation was growing up in Millbrook, with expanded notions of possibility, seeing success that looked like them, hearing stories of triumph over adversity in accents that sounded like their own families. The local elementary school's career day, once dominated by factory supervisors and truck drivers, now featured entrepreneurs, tech innovators, and international business owners. 10-year-old Jose Martinez, whose family had arrived from Guatemala just 2 years earlier, announced to his class that he wanted to become a bank owner who helps people's dreams come true, just like Mr. Kieran. When asked what he would do differently, Jose thought for a moment and said, "I would have a playground in the bank lobby, so kids could have fun while their parents got help with their dreams." The comment, captured on video by a proud teacher, went viral on social media. Within weeks, Meridian Trust Bank had installed a small but thoughtfully designed children's area, complete with books in multiple languages and quiet activities. The message was clear. This was a place where entire families were welcome, where the next generation could begin imagining their own possibilities. Kieran often reflected on how the most painful moment of his professional life had become the catalyst for his greatest contribution. The rejection that had felt like an ending had actually been a beginning, not just for him, but for an entire community that had learned to see opportunity where others saw only risk. Standing in his office each morning, looking out at the bustling streets below, Kieran was reminded that true success isn't measured in personal achievement alone. It's measured in how many doors you open for others after someone has closed them on you. The loan application that was rejected had become a blueprint for inclusion, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to being counted out is making sure everyone else gets counted in. They had rejected his loan application, but in doing so, they had accidentally created the architect of their own transformation, and in the end, that transformation had proven to be exactly what the community needed. Not just one successful business, but an entirely new way of believing in each other